In this video, we're going to continue our Java tutorials and go into part 2. We're going to finish up on some variables and then we're going to move on to the basics of classes and the importance of understanding those. So let's get into that. Okay, so here we are where we left it at the end of the previous Java tutorial. So what we're going to do first is delete everything. So again, check the first tutorial out, the Java one, if you haven't done that already. So now I want to talk briefly about conditional processing. Now, the best way to show you that is to give you an example. And this is something that you will be using quite extensively through the course. So let's start by putting in a value, an integer. Integer lifes equals 3. Now, what if you wanted the computer to print a message to say that if the lifes were 0, the player's lives, we're using a game analogy here, if the lives left were 0, to print out a message to say game over, otherwise to print out a message to say you aren't dead yet. So we need a condition to put in there. And one way to do that is to use the if code. So we can type if lives, the variable name, is less than 1. So in other words, it's 0 or less than 0. We can type system.out.println. We'll type game over. Game over. Now what we can do is if that's not true, in other words, the lives is greater than 0, so this hasn't worked, in other words, we can put else system.out.print you are still alive. Very simple example, but let's try that. We'll save that and we'll run it. And it says down the bottom here, you are still alive. But if we change our lives to 0 and save it, game over. So you can see that essentially there's a block of code. If lives is less than 0, then you do this bit of code. But if this failed, in other words, that is not true, that condition is false, so lives isn't less than 0, then the computer goes to the else and then shows that instead. So that's something we're going to be doing, that sort of conditional, sort of checking whether something is true or not, and then branching to one of two different places, or sometimes even more, is the core of a lot of computer languages. Because you could probably think, if you think about it, if you weren't able to do that, it would make for applications that weren't very powerful. You need to be making these decisions all the time. Like again, in a game sense, if you're developing a game, if you didn't have a way to test whether the lives were, the player had used all his lives up, you really couldn't go to a game over. So we can also change this, because what's happening is effectively internally, the computer or Java is creating an internal variable to check that. So we can create that variable, and you can use a Boolean to do that. So we can type Boolean, we can call it is game over, and we can say equals lives less than 1. So what we're saying is, whatever this is, the result of this operation, put the value of that into is game over. And here, instead of putting if lives less than 1, we can just replace that with the variable name, is game over. So if we save that and run that, so the way it's set up now, if is game over, we're checking for lives less than 0, that should still really work exactly the same as it did before. So we're going to run that. And if we change our lives back to 3, you can see firstly game over worked. Changing lives back to 3. Are you still alive? That was meant to say you are. You are still alive. Okay, so that's really another type. It's a Boolean type, which is a true false. So that's really what it gives, and we can print that out. We can print out a Boolean system.out.println is game over. You can run that. and you can see it's false. So it's true or false, or we can put the life's to 0 again. If we run that, down the bottom it's true. So that's an important concept of Boolean, and we'll be discussing that as we go through. And look, there are a lot of other types, but you don't really need to use those, and we probably won't be using them a lot. There's other types in Java. They're called primitive types, which is like the basic type of variable. And for example, there's a byte, there's a short, there's a long. All of these are primitive types that are built into Java. We'll talk about those in the course when and if we need to. But if you've got a handle on the fact that really all of these things are just types, if I have to introduce a new type in the apps course, the course as we go through, then we'll discuss it at that point. Okay, so that's the basics of variables. So we're going to delete that and move on now. Delete that. Okay. So the next concept we want to talk about is classes. Now we did create a class here, a public class, when we first started the tutorial. But what we're going to do is talk a little bit more about those. Because what classes are, usually are noun. Effectively, they're nouns within an application. Like for example, a player or an enemy or a tree maybe, or even a bullet. Using game analogies, computer game analogies, these would all be or could be classes in a game that we've actually written. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the process of creating a class so that you can get a good handle on why you'd want to use a class, and then once you've hopefully agreed that they are useful, how to use them. So to create a class, we've already done one once, so we're going to do the same thing. Click on the package, right click on new, click on class, and then we're going to type player. We're going to create a class called player, which is going to be some basic information about our player in the game. Now, unlike the demo class that we set up, we're going to take this tick off because we don't want to run this. We don't want to run this separately, and you'll see why soon. Most classes you create, and certainly all the classes you create for Android apps, will always have that off. Really, the public static void main was a once-only thing in the demo class that we set up for testing purposes so that we could output the information on the console. So definitely make sure that's off. We're going to click on finish. And you can see what's happened here is that Eclipse has automatically created for us a class. It's put the package command in, and that's because we clicked on the package over here. So it's put that in for us, and it's put the right words in so that from Java's point of view, we now have a class called player. So the good thing with a class is it can be a container for lots of variables, and it can even have program code that relates just to a player. So we're going to go through and explore that a little bit further. So first things first, why don't we set up some variables that would be appropriate if this was a player class in a game. So to do that, you actually click on and make sure that you're in the class itself. So you're in the line under the first left brace. And what are some things that maybe a player would have? Well, they might have a handle name, sort of their alias or their handle. So I'm going to type string. Let's call it their handle name. And that will be the name that they use in the game. Let's have another one. What about lives? How many lives the player currently has? We could have another one. We could have the level, maybe what level they've reached so far in the game. And then lastly, what about score? They would be sort of 3 or 4 very common things that you'd see in a player, that a game would have to record about a player. So this class, we're able to define it so that in the one place, all this information is stored within that class. So what we probably want to do, and one of the principles of object-oriented programming, and that's what classes are all about, is we want to encapsulate this information. So in other words, we want to give the responsibility to the player, to the player class, to do some updating. So in other words, if you can imagine this, that if there's another class somewhere else that is, perhaps the enemy, you don't want the enemy to be able to change the level of the player. You might want the enemy to be able to change the number of lives. In other words, if they kill the player, but you'd still want the player ultimately to manage and to control that. So in other words, you probably don't want another class accessing these variables directly. And just so we're clear, in a class, technically, these things aren't variables. And now in a class, variables are the more, like the Java definition is a field. We call those fields mostly. You can also refer to them as instant variables, but for this point onwards, we're going to refer to these as fields. So that's the the right Java terminology for a variable that's in a class. Okay, so at the moment we've defined this, and there's no value associated to any of these things. And the reason is, at this point in time when we're setting up this player class, it really is just a template. So if you can imagine, if you're playing a game, we don't want to hard code the name of the person and how many lives they've got, because that could change depending on which player is playing the game. So all we're doing now is, what a class is a template for an object that we're ultimately going to create, and that's really the difference between the two things. So this is just a template. We need to put in the space. We need to allocate the space for the fields, and we need to find a way to initialize these. So to initialize a class, the concept Java terminology is a constructor, and a constructor is used to initialize a class. So it can do things like set the score or set the lives, etc., to a certain value, and it can do other sort of common initialization. Now, for example, if it's a player class, it might do something like redraw the screen, or whatever the case might be, or it might save their score automatically. Those types of things. So let's create a public constructor so that we can use this player class somewhere else. So one way to do a constructor is we just type in the word public and type in the name of the class. So we do public player and put 2 brackets in there. And then we put our left brace, and Eclipse automatically added the right brace. Now what this is if by default, this is what we want to happen. So here is where we might set all our initial values by default, which can still be overwritten later. So let's just say the handle name equals unknown player. So when we first start out, that's going to be essentially the name. So lives, oops, not int. We're going to put lives equals 3, level equals 1, score equals 0. That would be something you'd commonly see in a game. And what we'll do now is we're going to save that. So I'm doing Command S, again, Control S on a PC. We've now saved it off. Let's go and show you now how to create an object from this template. So the way we do that, we go back into our demo class, and we're going to type player. And I'm going to put Tim, but player Tim, this is the player class for me, equals new player. So in other words, what we're saying is we want Java to create a new object for player and to store it in this variable. So at this point, again, we've got a variable that hasn't been used, or a class that hasn't been used. Okay, so at the moment, what we could do is we can print out the value. So we could go system.out.print tim.handle name. So what's happening there is, and I'm going to save that, and then we'll just run it to confirm it, then I'll go back to the other code. You can see it's been set to unknown player. So what's happened is, what we've said is, we want the system to print out Tim dot, then whatever the name of the field we've defined in player, and that was called handle name. Likewise, we can do something like this. We can go Tim dot handle name equals Tim. So we can set the name to Tim, and then we can print that out again. Save that. If I run it, first time it goes through, it prints the unknown name, and then you can see it's been we've set the value to Tim and we've printed it out. But this wouldn't be good programming practice. we don't normally want to allow the program code that's external or outside of the player class to access the variables this way. There's normally a certain way we want them to handle, because if you think about it, let's just say that you wanted to validate that the handle name was more than 3 letters long. You might have had a requirement in your game that the handle name has to be 4 or more characters. Well, we've got no ability to do any checking there because we've actually just typed it in there and then, and it can't execute any of the code in the player Java file, to do that. So I'll just save that and I'll just open up the demo one again as well. Move those over. Okay, so what we should really do is set these to private and find another way to access them. I'm going to show you how to do that. So go back to player, and what you would normally do in a class is set these to private. Private. I'll just copy that and paste them all. And what this private command is doing is saying, only let this class or code that is executing in player update this. So we're going to save that. And now you saw straight away we've got an error. And the reason we've got an error is it's closed off access to that. So we now cannot access it that way. And what we'll do is we'll delete that. And I'll show you how we can now access that. So what we've done is we've transferred control back to the player class for doing the processing. Okay, so at the moment there's no way to access those variables unless we're in the player class. Okay, but what we can do is we can use something that's called a getter. So we can type public string get handle name, and we can type return handle name. So what we've done there is we've created some program code. We've created a method, which is really just a name for some code that's executed, but then it's going to return the handle name, which in other words is going to return the string of whatever is contained in the handle name. So if we go back to the demo.java and we type system.out.print Tim dot, there's no, you notice how those other variables aren't there anymore, but there is a get handle name now. So we're going to get handle name and save it. So we'll be able to run that, and that should come back and say unknown player, which it does. But where this gets interesting is, let's talk about updating. So we're going to do an update. We're going to add another getter called, a setter. So we've got public void set handle name string handle. Then we can put handle name equals handle. So what we're allowing to happen here is we're passing a parameter. So we're passing, and I'm going to show you how to do this from demo. We are passing the handle name we want to use into player and getting the player to set this. So in other words, this demo class hasn't got any direct way to access it, but we can indirectly access it by typing tim.set handle name Tim. And just to confirm it works, we'll print that out. Save it and run it. And again, we've got Tim. So we've called the program code that resides in player to set the value. Now where this gets interesting is we can put our validation in here. So what we can do here maybe is put if handle dot length is less than 4, return. I'll save that. So what we're saying here is we're going to accept this handle, but if the length of what's been passed to us is less than 4, we're not going to update it. So I'll show you how that works. So if we run this again, you can see the first time it's executed, it was unknown, and we've tried to set the handle and it's still unknown. So in other words, we've been able to validate it, and it would also mean that from the player perspective, if you're controlling this class, if you then decided to make it okay to be less than 3, you could change it here, and no code's changed from this point of view, but suddenly when we run it, it's now allowing Tim to go through. So this is really the beauty of encapsulating data or encapsulating your functionality within a class, because all your processing is done here and all the rules aren't sort of written out from this point of view. So that's really one of the major concepts of a class as such. So let's just expand on this constructor a little bit further. We've got this default constructor which we talked about where it was set to unknown. But what we can also do is there might be situations where we do want to, when we create the object for the first time, we might want to set the player to a certain name. So we might want to type public player, player string handle. And we can type set handle name handle, and then we can put the other ones. We can put lives equals 3, level equals 1, score equals 0. Okay, so what's happening is, we'll go back and show you how to use that. So we can now do another example. Player Louise equals new player, but we can set that value initially, Louise. And now if we go back and, we just go back and print that out, system.out.println, printline, Louise dot get handle name. So we've made this more concise. We've basically eliminated the need to put that set handle. So if we run this now, I'll just expand it out so we can see it a bit better. We can see that Louise has been set for the first time. So in other words, wrong one. This particular constructor never got called, and the reason it didn't get called is because this one was executed, because we passed the handle. We sent that handle through. Alright, so in terms of the other thing to note is with these getters and setters, one of the cool things that Eclipse does, because you can imagine if you had 20 of these, if you had 20 fields that you wanted to set up for a player, it can probably get quite annoying typing them all. But what you can do is you can right click, source, generate getters and setters. And you can see that it's automatically figured out that we've used handle name, so it's not going to try and get us to redo it. We can just do select all, and it's going to automatically create them for these 3. So you can see what it's done. It's set those for us automatically. So we've now got the ability to go back in here now. We can type Louise.set level 5. Then we can go system.out.println Louise.get, and notice all these other methods are there now. Get level. And the reason that's coming up with an error is because I haven't saved it. So I just need to go back and save that. You can see the error has disappeared, and we can now run that. And there you go. 5. So in other words, it's set level 5 and it's successfully done it. So there you go. That's a bit of an quick overview on how to or what classes are. So you've got a better understanding of how they are used, because they are, or how to create them, I should say, and what they are, because they are used extensively within this course. And Android has got a lot of functionality built in, and we're going to be exploring a lot of that as we go through. So let's move on to the next video.